Here at Psych with Mike, we are committed to delivering the best, clinically sound psychology information that we possibly can to our audience. Brett and I have decades of clinical experience as well as educational experience, and we want to make sure that we're able to deliver that to the audience and that always be free. So after 2 years, to be able to take the show to the next level, we are going to open ourselves up to advertising. But before that can happen, we need everybody who hears this message to follow the link that is on the show notes on the podcast page or is on the show notes in the YouTube. Click on that link and fill out a survey that is literally 10 seconds long, so it won't take you more than 10 seconds. Do it right now. I'll wait. Okay, so see, that was really fast and really easy, and it's going to help us to be able to attract advertisers to the show and be able to take the show to the next level. Thanks for listening, and we hope that you enjoy Psych with Mike.
Push the right button and be sure you're looking correctly in the camera. You want to look like TikTok.
This is Dr. Michael Mahan. Welcome into the Psych with Mike library. I'm here with my good friend and colleague, Mr. Brett Newcomb.
How are you today?
I'm doing good. You're making fun of me because of my TikTok videos.
I make fun of you because I love you and you're fun to tease. And you take it well.
So I have ventured into and I know it's TikTok, I say TikTok, but into TikTok. I've been doing short little, hopefully inspirational videos. I actually had one that as of this day has gone to 52,000, and I was pretty impressed by that. But I have been I've been getting feedback from you and my wife, and actually also other people who have viewed the videos.
Everybody's a critic.
That the image that I am presenting is not as put together as it could be.
Well,
so your exact complaint or criticism or critique, let's say critique.
It's critique, not a complaint.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it was.
It is that really two things. The camera angle is not optimal.
Yeah.
And that
I think that was the word I used. It's not optimal.
That I when I start the video, you can see me moving away from the camera to get set, and so I need to cut off that front edge.
It needs to come on like a pro.
Yeah.
You're ready to go. You got something to say. Say it.
Yeah. So now I need to start being more
and there are those
polished.
There are those that might even suggest that these podcasts take too long to get started.
Well, they might, but I think that's the fun of the podcast. I mean, if you listen to podcasts,
we're engaging.
They don't run into their immediate message instantaneously. There's a little light banter.
This is the only podcast that I listen to.
As you should.
Actually, that's not true. I listen to a couple, but
yeah. And they all have light banter that tries to make the podcast entertaining, doesn't just wham hit you. Because what's different about us than serial killer podcasts or UFO hunters or Sasquatch or whatever is that the information that we are putting out in this podcast is like real and legitimate. I mean, this is actual.
I mean, you don't believe in UFOs and stuff?
Oh, sure I do.
Oh.
But that doesn't mean that I think that UFO podcasts are putting out real scientific information.
Yeah, they don't originate in Roswell.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I'm not saying that we're the only psychology podcast on the internet. I think we're the best, but we're actually putting out real information, and so we're trying to do that in an entertaining way. And a part of it is to have a setup for each of the shows that is entertaining and hopefully draws people in. And then we segue into some information that may be a little bit complex. Today's topic is a great example of that. A lot of people are not very well versed in Jungian psychology. If they are, and Jung called it analytic psychology, if they are, then a lot of that is through popular media, which may not necessarily be an accurate depiction of Jung's theory. So we're going to talk about that, and that's a pretty heady concept and pretty heady stuff. And we want to do that in a way that makes it accessible to every person.
Yes.
Okay.
Took those words right out of my mouth.
I thought you had more.
No, I got that. Actually, I was just thinking about the German, Swiss, and Russian writers are really, in my experience, very turgid and difficult to read. I mean, they require a lot of concentration. Sure. So I think some of the adaptations that you can find in other writers who take the fundamental idea and say, well, let me put this in plain English, that those are easier to read and understand than reading the original.
Oh, yeah. Well, and, I love existential psychology, and Rollo May is one of the best-known existential psychologists in the United States, and I find him somewhat difficult to read.
Yeah.
So, really, really informative, really, and even though he was writing a lot of his stuff in the late 1960s, you read it, it feels like he wrote it yesterday, but sometimes difficult.
So the language hasn't moved away from his writing style?
I think that a lot of the older theorists wrote in a prose. It's like Noam Chomsky, who, if anybody knows that name, he was a linguist. He is a linguist. He's still alive.
Still alive, yeah. Like Yalom.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But even as a linguist, I mean, he's impossible to read. Anybody who says that they enjoy reading Noam Chomsky, I'm thinking is trying to make themselves sound smart, because I've read him and I think I'm fairly intelligent, and I find him extremely difficult to read. Have you read him?
Snippets.
Yeah. Do you think he's difficult to read?
I think for me, reading falls into two envelopes. If I'm reading for pleasure, I read quickly and skim things. If I'm reading to learn something or to absorb something, I have to read more slowly and carefully. So I don't know if I approach reading him differently than I approach reading a Louis L'Amour novel.
Gotcha.
But I think I do. Because I think the level of concentration and disciplined attention that it requires. So I don't know if that's me trying to absorb the information or that's a critique of his writing style.
Yeah, that's a good point. But for the Jungian analytic psychology, there are two real main points or aspects of it that I think are in the popular culture but may not be well understood. So that's the collective unconscious and the idea of archetypes. So I think it would be, firstly, important. I used to have a constitutional law professor. I had a constitutional law professor when I was an undergraduate who was adamant that firstly was not a word. And if you wrote it in an essay, he would immediately fail you.
So thusly, he would fail you.
Yeah. So I don't know if that's true or not, but
well,
I know
the
that
adverbial form of first. I didn't think that first was an adverb, but perhaps it is.
Yeah. Well, I'm assuming that he was very intelligent. He seemed very intelligent, and I assumed he knew. But I find myself saying that, and
he was putatively intelligent.
Yeah. So the collective unconscious, as defined by Jung, is this experience or memory that all of us have that we are born with.
All humans from all cultures.
Right.
Yeah, it's a universal concept.
Right.
And that we all are born with that knowledge and information, even though we don't have language. I mean, it's not a language-driven concept. So that if you see a bear, the description often is you are frightened and run from the bear. And you don't have to have your brain cognitively process 3 or 4 sentences like, oh my God, that's a bear, you should run. You just reflexively do that in the face of danger. Or if you see rageful mom, you go away somewhere, because as an infant who has no capacity for self-survival, what you instinctively know is to avoid rageful mom and to come to loving, warm mom. So that argument is one that most people can readily accept because they have those experiences or they can relate to them, and they say, well, that makes sense.
Right.
But it's hard to articulate. It's hard to write all that out in a way that is consistent and makes sense.
And as we have evolved, there are two main biological explanations for the collective unconscious. Whether or not these are the accurate explanations, we do believe that there may actually be a biological mechanism within which the collective unconscious could be passed and make sense. So the first one is that the microtubules, which are structures in the brain that are necessary for your neurons to function, we don't have to go into what their function is.
Thank God.
Are actually built at a quantum level that is beyond the ability for current science to explain.
Measure, to identify.
And that there is a potential there that the way in which these microtubules are constructed has a mechanism in it that allows us to experience not only the collective unconscious, but even the idea of being conversing with a deity.
As George Michael's saying, you've got to have faith.
Right, sure.
Yeah.
So that's one explanation. Then the other explanation...
That was before I Want Your Sex, I think, but...
Yeah, well, maybe at the same time.
Oh, the flip side.
Yeah. The genome of the microfauna, so the bacteria that's in your gut, there's actually a greater genetic diversity of bacteria in your gut than there is in the whole rest of your body combined.
Right.
And the bacteria in the gut, we know for sure, has the capacity to generate neurotoxic, and not neurotoxic in that it's deadly, but neurotoxic in that it can have an effect on the way your brain processes information, and that the bacteria in the gut could also be a mechanism. So again, we're not saying that these things are the way that the collective unconscious does work, but there are potentially biological explanations for how the collective unconscious, a mechanism for how it could work. And so we now believe that that may actually be more real than, because one of the complaints about Jung is that he was very spiritual, very mystical. And he was saying these things, and people were saying, well, that's really metaphysical. And so I don't know. It sounds like it makes sense. Yes, I have this experience of harsh, critical mom, and so I know what that is. But could that really, how could I have had that the minute that I was born?
So that comes back to one of the discussions of the distinctions between psychology and sociology. Mm-hmm. Psychology studies individual human beings and their experience and the way they process, the way they learn, the way they see, the way they experience. And sociology studies people in groups. So what's the group pattern? And mm-hmm. Jung is talking about the group pattern. Mm-hmm. When this group of people have this innate response or understanding or awareness, right, from which they then make individual
But
choices.
he talked about the group pattern, but then each person experiences that individually. So there still has to be the ability to translate the group pattern into the individual.
Is that a distinction without a difference?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, for the average person, right? The average person is going to say, oh yes, I've had that experience of harsh, critical mom, so it makes sense to me that that is something that is a part of the collective unconscious. But how would that be bestowed upon me at birth? How could I have had that before I had any learning?
You don't know what you had before you had any learning.
Right.
You don't know what you had before you had language, which brings Noam Chomsky back to the mm-hmm. table. I remember I had a roommate in college. We'd sit around at night and discuss the nature of the universe, and a group of us would frequently focus on religion and what were our metaphysical beliefs, what do we believe about religion. And this young man consistently said, I believe this, and I've never questioned it, and I accept it totally, and I'm upset that you're questioning it, mm-hmm. whatever it was we were talking about. We said, why? Well, how do you think that way? What brings you to the table with that? And he said, because that's what my parents taught me, mm-hmm. and they never lied to me, and so that's what I believe. And so he didn't ever question the underpinnings of
right.
his faith, which must be a very comfortable way to live.
It is, except that I've always believed that anybody who is threatened, anybody whose beliefs are threatened by what you believe,
right.
doesn't really believe what they say they do. Because I'm very comfortable in what I believe, but what I can absolutely tell you is that what I believe is not threatened by what you believe. And I am completely comfortable with you having a completely different belief system. and I'm not going to try and persuade you, and I don't really want you to try and persuade me. Now, if through the course of our conversation something makes logical sense to me, I'm not saying I don't adapt my views,
right,
but I think that people who genuinely believe something are not threatened by the belief of others.
So proselytizing and witnessing, which are components of most of the religions of which I'm aware,
Yeah.
to you are non-threatening because you are anchored in your own beliefs.
Sure.
Is that what you're saying?
But it's also, I don't feel the compulsion, like if the organization says you should go proselytize, I don't feel that compulsion. I feel like that you should be an example through the way that you live, and then you can tell other people, this is what I believe. If they look at that and say, oh, I want some of that, then they're perfectly capable of going out and finding it for themselves. I don't think that it should be my job to proselytize to them. It should be my job to be an example.
So to extrapolate that into politics, my strong belief is that you should be able to have conversations with people who believe differently.
Absolutely.
Without getting enraged and outraged. That you should be respectful of the difference and say, I have to agree to disagree.
Absolutely.
I don't agree with you, but I still respect you.
And that's what we've lost.
Well, I still value that and seek that out in my relationships.
And so before we went live on the mics, you were actually talking about this idea of patterns. So the collective unconscious lays the foundation for what Jung talked about as the archetypes. And you actually presented what I think is a really unique, or at least it was unique to me. I had never thought of it this way, but it makes a lot of sense that what the archetypes are is really a way of being able to identify patterns.
So we were talking about the difference between Freud and Jung, who wrote and studied at the same time frame, and are foundational leaders in the development of psychology as a field of thought. And Freud is so much bigger in the field than Jung. So why did that happen? And I was saying that I believe that as a clinician, even whether you're taught this in school or whether you learn this through the experience of practice, that what you learn is to listen for and look for patterns in someone's life. And then when you see a pattern that keeps repeating itself in their life, you want to put it in a package. You want to label it and be able to understand it and communicate to others about it. And I said that I think that's in large measure what the people who have adapted themselves to Jungian psychology and the archetype theory, and the 4 basic archetypes, and then you see 12 or 15 others that get labeled and put out as patterns, so that when you communicate with people about the hero or the scapegoat, or in most theories, in my experience, do the same thing. You look in studying alcoholism, the alcoholic family. You have these roles that they talk about. Well, it's just another word for pattern. And I think archetype is another word for pattern. And so we are looking for patterns that people adapt themselves to or function from within that framework. And then the challenge begins to be, okay, if we can identify the pattern, are there ways that we can make changes? Are you doomed forever to be this way, or can you change to a different pattern that might work better for you, be healthier for you, more successful in your life? And so as we were talking about Jungian archetypes, I was framing it as patterns that I can understand, may or may not be set in concrete reality the way the universe works, but at least it's a useful tool for me as a clinician to present to a client, this seems to be happening in your life. This is a pattern. It comes at cost and benefit. Let's do a cost-benefit ratio. Can you afford the cost of your choices? Can you afford to continue following this pattern? Are you willing to accept the cost of that, the pain of that, the dysfunction of that, the disruption of that? Or would you like to find a new pattern that doesn't come with these same costs? And so I think that's what the dance of therapy becomes.
So the original 4 archetypes that Jung talked about, and again, as you say, that people have layered additional archetypes on top of those, were the persona, the shadow, the anima and animus, and the self. And so what you're saying is that those represent 4 basic philosophical patterns within which human beings can perceive themselves and their reality. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think and I think there are many people, not just Jung, that do the same thing with maybe different terminology. So you talk about, am I an introvert or an extrovert or an ambivert?
Which actually was originally a Jungian concept.
So go back to that.
Yeah.
So, predominantly, am I leaning towards being an introvert? How does that work for me in my life? Do I have a job? Have I chosen a job that allows me to work alone? I mean, certainly today's pandemic, if I can work from home, I can be more introverted and still get all kinds of social accolades for my success. But if I have to go out and give a speech somewhere to an audience, am I going to struggle through that? Am I going to be able to do it successfully? So I think, again, the question for me isn't, was Jung right, and did his 4 labels identify the core realities of the universe? Are they just useful data points to help understand the pattern and be able to communicate about the pattern? Because to me, the language is critical in understanding. Going back to Chomsky, I think language matters, and the words that we hear in our heads, and I used to tell my clients that all the time, you hear language, you hear should language in your head that gets in the way. Can we change the word that you use? And they're like, huh? And I said, can we change responsibility,
right,
I-B-I-L-I-T-Y, to responsibility, A-B-I-L-I-T-Y, implying that if you have responsibility, you have the ability to respond. And if you have the responsibility, it's a burden which you're trapped with. And once they can begin to see that, and I would try to help them change the dialogue in their head from must or should or can't to will or won't. Again, with the power of choice. I have the power to choose to do this or choose not to do this, instead of I'm trapped. I'm a victim of these circumstances. And that's all language. And that tracks back to whether it's a Jungian archetype or somebody else's, Sears and Bandera, the social theories. I think those things matter.
And so just to put this out on the table, the persona, so according to Jung, the persona is the image that we project outward to other people. Then the shadow are all of the things that we want to hide. And then the anima and animus, anima is the male's impression of femalism. The animus is the female impression of maleism. And then the self is the unification of the unconscious and the conscious and how we perceive ourselves. And that's where the idea of a mandala comes from, is the complex interaction of those things that creates our impression of selfhood. So those are the original archetypes. And I hear you saying that for you, I've heard you say many times that you don't gravitate towards labels. I'm a big label guy. You're kind of the opposite. You try and not see labels. But
I try to not see the person as a label. I need to understand the labels so that if it's a pattern that we should discuss, I can say, look at this behavior. This is how I understand this behavior. Am I understanding it accurately? You can tell me yes or no. But I'm not going to put the label on you that you're depressed or narcissistic or schizophrenic.
Because what I was going to say, or what I was going to ask is, if there are these patterns, if you agree that these patterns exist, then what's the difference between the patterns and a label?
Behavior.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Your behavior establishes a pattern. You experience yourself as doing certain things or having certain things done to you. So we have to put words on that. And that's the label.
To be able to communicate.
Yeah,
it only
you're
makes
more
sense.
than the label. You have, I mean, that's the whole Yalom thing.
Right.
You don't see the client as a label. Oh, this person is depressed. I say, you have depression right now. So let's talk about what depression is. And let's talk about the skills we have for fighting depression. But I'm not going to say, you're depressed. You're depressive.
Right.
You depress the hell out of me.
So... that wasn't a shot.
Yeah, no. Not personally.
So do you see then these 4 archetypal labels as patterns in the human consciousness?
No, I think that's too simplistic a reduction.
Okay.
I see the larger group, the 12 or 15, and I can see those categories of behavior.
So you don't see the archetypes as much as individual concepts as much as they are group concepts.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's a really good distinction. I've never thought about it that way. That I see what you're saying there. Yeah. So just to maybe we're talking a little bit too archaically. So just to break that down a little bit. So what you are saying is that for you, the Jungian archetypes create an explanation of patterns in social behavior that are at the macro scale, not at the micro scale.
Always.
Okay.
Always. Because same thing with learning nonverbals. You know, both of us have had courses that teach you to read nonverbals. We've even taught courses like that. And the point that I always try to make in those conversations is we can have a generic explanation of closed knees, closed arms is a rejection position. But that may not be specifically applicable to that this individual. So you have to find out.
It may be true at the macro level, but not true at the micro level. Yeah. That's a great distinction.
Yeah.
And I've never thought about it that way, but I'm going to now, and I think that makes a ton of sense. And you're absolutely right. With the nonverbals, yes, we think of that in terms of macro. That may not be the micro experience, right? That person may be cold. They're huddled up because they're shivering, but then they still need to be aware of
that other people are interpreting it that way.
Yeah. And
so,
to say
so your husband sees that you're rejecting him and you're just cold.
Right.
Or you flick your eyes up before you answer me. I've been taught, oh, you're preparing a lie. That may not be what you're doing. You may do it differently. So I have to find out if you're lying to me, planning to lie to me, or is that some other behavior?
Okay, so we're going down a different tangent, but I do want to ask this question. So in your opinion, or in your clinical experience or expertise, is it the individual's responsibility to say to the other, I'm not rejecting you, I'm cold, or is it the other's responsibility to ask the other, I feel like you're rejecting me, is that accurate?
In a relationship, I think it's a mutual responsibility.
Mutual, okay.
Because we're striving for accurate understanding.
Yeah, and I agree, and I want to, that's why I want to make that point, is because people are going to be listening to this and they're going to say, well, I'm not rejecting you. You never asked me for clarification.
So then
the other person's going to say,
I statements instead of you statements. I am getting the impression that you are not listening to me, or you've shut me out. Is that accurate?
So
can you tell me if I'm understanding correctly? Are you finished with this conversation? Because you just disengaged.
So
in my
each individual
not accusative,
is responsible to request clarifying information from the other. And that's
so
what
then you have to teach them to do that, because when you make assumptive communications, you're in trouble. I assume that I know what you're thinking. I assume that I know what you want, and I'm going to go down the path of my assumptions. You're sitting here, I can ask you, do you want a cup of coffee? Can I get you a cup of coffee? Will you get me one? Instead of like, you just are selfish.
Exactly. You know? But then the individual has to, though, also be aware that certain nonverbal behaviors through the collective unconscious and this perception of archetypal patterns is going to be projecting an impression onto the world, and then, if that is okay with you, then that's fine.
Well, you need to learn the language. You need to learn to say to your wife, Jung says you're a cold and rejecting person. Not me, certainly, because I'm not accusing you of that.
Correct.
Yeah. Was he right? And then your wife needs to just learn how to laugh and say, shut up.
Yeah. I would never do that.
Yes, you would. I've heard you do that.
I've never said to my wife, you're a cold and... Well, that may not be true.
Don't go there.
Well, see, so in the end,
Yeah.
you were questioning the light banter. I think that was fantastic. I think that was a really, really good 25 minutes.
It certainly went quickly for me.
Yeah. So hopefully this was helpful for people. As always, if you have any questions, you can get us at psychwithmike.com. And the music that appears in Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue. And as always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.